Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the CHIWORK online series, a weekly conversation on HCI and the future of work. I'm Navina. I'm a postdoc at Harvard University. I'm one of the technical program chairs who host these conversations, along with Max, Aaron, Toby, and Shadan. Thank you to the general chairs, Andrew and Orit, and the student volunteers, Alberta, Isabel, and Nabil, who make the series happen. And as usual, we're recording this first half of the Q&A, and we welcome questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to them. And then we'll stop the recording for the second half and open up the floor to more questions and discussion. And at this point, I'd like to welcome our amazing guest, Melissa Densmore. Melissa is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She directs the HCI lab and coordinates the South African International branch of the Hasso-Plattner Institute Research School. And her research explores digital content creation in collaboration with low resource communities in the context of community wireless networks and for maternal and child health and well-being, with a special interest in understanding how to conduct ICT research in an appropriate and ethical and community-centered manner. She currently serves on the SIGCHI Research Ethics Committee as chair of her institutional review board and is general chair for ACM Compass 2023. Thanks for joining us today, Melissa.
Great, happy to be here.
So to start off the Q&A, I was wondering if you could tell us about your work on maintaining community networks. And I'm thinking especially of the work on understanding the power and ownership dynamics among stakeholders, and especially universities, considering that's where like your research team is.
Great. Yeah, so I've been working with David Johnson, who did his work on community wireless networks in also in Southern Africa. And when he came back to South Africa and I happened to be here, we started working together on building a community wireless network in kind of the southern area of Cape Town in a community called Masimupulele. And over time, we ended up moving the community wireless network to Ocean View, which is another nearby community, also a township. But in South African parlance, the Masimupulele is a Black township, so Black Africans, and a lot of immigrants from Eastern Cape, where Ocean View community is a colored township, which in apartheid times, were basically, if you were Black African, you were in one township. And if you were colored, which meant if you were indigenous, Khoi or San, if you were Indian, if you were Chinese, or if you were mixed race, then you got put into separate colored townships. So here colored is not a catch-all for anybody who's not white, but it's actually a very specific people group. And in Cape Town, you get another group called Cape Colored, which are often descendants of Malay slaves who came with the British colonists. And so we've been working in that community for a long time. We worked hard to just identify people in the community that were really interested in the idea of what a community wireless network could be, to provide training for them on setting up wireless towers that would link together in a mesh network to provide that community wireless network. We've provided them with internet connections, sometimes subsidized by research funds, but often negotiated with local organizations to provide internet for that community, and worked out ways for that community to actually build that network themselves and maintain the network, and also to develop a business model around maybe selling access to internet or selling access to network services. And I've been thinking about like, okay, how does this get framed in work? And there is that care work in terms of actually building what is effectively a living lab for research from our perspective, but building also community. And so this is the kind of the turn that my research is taking. How do we really build and strengthen communities, and what role does digital play in this? And I will say the first iteration of that, it's actually the second iteration of that community wireless network, it petered out, right? Like as much as we had kind of buy-in and several members of the community forming a co-op, they were very too willing to kind of defer to what we wanted to do as university members, and that their interests were really much more self-serving rather than community serving. But that the work of engaging communities was not something that they necessarily bought into as much. But there was one particular person that was a director of the co-op, along with the others, that said, you know what, no, this is something I really want to take ownership. And actually, even before we started doing the community wireless, he had written in community wireless networks into like a proposal for the city council. So he had independent interest in this idea. And so last year he left his job as a teacher in the local high school and started up a company that is, and also applied for grant independently of us to basically expand that network and maintain it. And through that, he's also gotten a lot of support from the Association for Progressive Communications, training up him, and also training up several young people in the community to also maintain that network. We've struggled to hand over maintenance of that community network to this person, right? Like, he's very, very engaged, and he really, really wants to own that and have like learn everything. And he's done a lot to learn everything. But I started digging into what the management interface was for monitoring and adding new nodes to the network, and I couldn't figure it out. And I've got a master's degree in networking, right? Like, and a PhD, right? And so the issue is these network management interfaces are really designed for people who are experienced network administrators. They're designed for people that have the time and have the background to just dig and figure it out. But when you're working with recent high school graduates, when you're working with community members that don't necessarily have, you know, a lot of experience with networking, like, it's a little bit harder. And honestly, we're in this age of user-centered design. We're HCI researchers. Why can we not build something more usable than Linux for configuring networks? But so I embarked on a project working with Lurvo Rivazotto and Naveen Baglako, and we actually started doing workshops on really speculative design, working with members of community wireless networks or prospective members of prospective community wireless networks to envision what they would want their wireless networks to be like, and how they would want to manage it. And I would say that what surprised us was that the two community wireless networks that we were doing this work in, one in India near Bangalore, and another one, my network here in Cape Town, are managed quite differently. Like, there's some commonalities, but the genesis of the group, the way ownership structures work, power dynamics were really different in each. One had been around for a long time, and so their infrastructure was like Jugad, like ad hoc, different equipment, different things, and they just did a lot of work to maintain it, and they had the expertise. Like, they had people coming into that community that had the computer science background that could maintain and monitor that network, and they were now living in that community. And then there's ours, where like there's the university researchers, and then there's the community members, and it is quite a different dynamic. But what is turning out to be really similar is that ad hocness. We call it a meshmash of equipment that they're pulling together this community wireless network from whatever equipment they can get, whatever equipment gets donated, whatever equipment is available on the market that is inexpensive and that will work for wireless networks. And the management is made that much harder. The maintenance of these networks is made that much harder, specifically because they're cobbled together, they're not compatible systems. I'm not sure where to go from there in terms of fixing this, but I think it's an incredible agenda. Like, I think it's not just community wireless networks that are completely unusable. I think there's a lot of network management interfaces that are completely unusable. And so I think this work of maintenance can be helped a lot by this work of community building between researchers in HCI and researchers in networking to really think through what human-centered networks and human-centered network infrastructures look like.
And I was wondering if you could, if I'm not sure if it's written out, put out there yet, but I was wondering if you could expand a bit on the speculative design, and maybe not even necessarily the outcomes, but like even the approaches that you took, because I mean, my impression is that a lot of the conversations on speculative design aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily bring out how they're tailored to local context. So I'm curious how you approach that.
So a lot of the speculative design work was really led by Naveen, who had been doing this kind of work within various communities around Tanapatna and Didi Hills, where we were doing this work. And so he has a lot of experience around it. I think what comes out is that speculative design is often about futuring, where we're able to use speculative design for kind of right now envisioning. And it's this envisioning of alternate realities is a nice form of inquiry. Other things that are like that we've experienced is that design activities where you ask people to draw and write really depend on those local communities. And so the same design activity we did in India, it's the facilitators, the researchers that were doing all the drawing. We were scribing what people said, and they could be very, very specific and say, look, no, you need to draw it this way and this way and this way. And so they're able to direct us as scribes in terms of writing out what they do. But we did the same thing, same kind of inquiry in Ocean View, and these were all high school graduates. They're working. Our meeting venue for the workshop was a high school classroom, like an extracurricular classroom, and so they were making these really beautiful posters with like lots of bullet points and hand-drawn fonts, and it was really great, and they loved it. But you get really different responses to the methodology depending on kind of social norms, maybe expectations around oral traditions versus written traditions. If you have grown up in a high school tradition where you're constantly making posters and reports, then when the researcher pulls out a bunch of posters and markers, you know exactly what to do. But that it wasn't the case necessarily with like the health navigators in Chanapatna. So I think there's something where we adjust what's there, but like to really think through what can we do also to make it like a practical envisioning that we can action in the immediate term for the communities where we're working, even if it's a slow term. Like I think university collaborations are often very sporadic. That makes, because like I get honors students, I have projects, either third year capstone, fourth year projects, and they're working in these spurts of time during specific parts of the academic calendar year. I get master's students that will work really, really hard for their second year of their master's, but then disappear when they're writing their dissertation, not really be available to those communities when they're doing their research proposal. And this is the same with the PhD students. And the only way you can get kind of ongoing community relationship is if you are stacking students on top of each other. So they're constantly building in and building new relationships, and that the touch point, that primary touch point for those organizations is really myself. And then they're just changing their kind of contact person and intermediary while we at like every couple of years, depending on the project. It's hard to figure out how to do this ethically. Like I always recall this one paper I read in grad school, can there be a feminist ethnography? And like this idea that we want to be really community centered, but we're always exit, right? And that exit is very natural. It's just a part of, it's just natural if you are not part of that community and staying part of that community for the rest of your life, right? So how do you do that in a way that is really good for the community? And I think working that out is hard.
And along those lines, I guess, do you think there are lessons here for community ICT projects overall? Like, I mean, you mentioned one strategy is stacking students. I guess any other thoughts on sustainability or kind of the building up community in service of maintenance?
Yeah, maintenance is not a research project, right? It's not necessarily appropriate for grad students to be doing perpetual maintenance. And relationship management's super, super important. I've explored a lot of different models in this, right? Because I did my PhD at Berkeley. We actually started an NGO to basically apply for funding to handle the maintenance and the deployment and taking the research and making it more practical. So the technology transfer or translation, depending how you put it. And that petered out for a lot of different reasons, then got picked up again by another PhD student. So when he graduated, he wanted a company that could help him build community wireless networks for Native American communities in California. And so there's the one kind of very Berkeley way to do it is you finish your PhD and then you start a company, right? And especially if there's profit, or you finish your PhD and you start a not for much profit or an NGO or something. I have been on the board of some of these profits, nonprofits, and I have had friends join a lot of the companies. And even these nonprofits, unless they're able to get funding, find a sustainable business model, find partners and other people to work with, they peter out after 1 to 2 years. I have a lovely regional advantage. I live in Cape Town and I've moved all of my work largely here, right? And so I can stay here and continue to be around forever, right? And so it's easier to kind of go for a weekend or put my students there because I'm not having to fly them there for a limited 2-week trip once a year, right? They're there and they can go and engage like on a regular basis. And I can send the stream of students without having to get $1 million worth of funding. And that's not always true for people doing that. And so I think this movement where people are starting to look rather than doing HCI for development or ICTD in another continent, they're starting to do work local to their own communities and collaborating with lead researchers in other continents. And I think that's another really good approach. I have also projects in Limpopo and in KwaZulu-Natal, which are 2 different states in South Africa. But the way these projects work is I'm working very closely with the University of Limpopo and HSRC research organizations, and they're taking the lead on organizing. They're taking the lead on public health oriented papers. All of their researchers are co-authors on all of the papers, and so just really thinking through like working through how do you do equitable partnerships? How do you see researchers as being really equal and having valuable contributions, even across borders and different styles of training, different styles of working, and in different disciplines. So my collaborators in Limpopo are from health sciences. My collaborator in KwaZulu-Natal, they're mostly social scientists, and then we have computing. And so we're able to come up with really interesting approaches when we devise that methodology together. But there's also this other approach where the researcher comes in with all the methodologies, prescribes it to everybody with no collaboration, and then you just do it, and then you have no power over whether you're an author or not, right? Like that is hard. And so I think thinking through that care work of building research community, building up equitable partnerships, both with other research organizations and with collaborating institutions, NGOs, or community members, is for me a lot of fun. It's hard, and I haven't done nearly enough reading on ethics, but it's something I love doing and love learning about.
Thank you for laying that out. I think it's a lot of food for thought, especially, people in the audience who are, maybe going to have their own research labs and things like that very soon. So to shift to your other, I guess, like other thread of work, can you tell us about your work with mothers and parents in general? I'm curious how this has been, kind of going beyond or shifting gears from kind of the focus so far in ICTD or HCI4D on like behavior change or M health.
I think the majority of this behavior change and health work has been working with intermediaries in the form of community health workers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, like it's much easier to gather community health workers in a workshop. They are the change agents that have been specifically either hired or recruited to work with parents. Each one represents a large body of people. But I think where we've seen wider usage of health, we don't actually see really transform behavior change, despite like decades of effort, right? And I think that what we do see is really much better record keeping, much more engaged health workers in cases where it's been implemented well and wisely. But what we also see outside of the research space is these tech organizations that do mHealth implementations, they're not even given any time or budget to do user-centered research. They're given a spec for an app, which they have to implement, and then everybody's surprised when nobody uses it. And this happens over and over again. And so what I wanted to do was to shift that conversation and say, well, we want to look at it from the bottom up, like not stop at the health workers, but talk to the parents. What are their priorities? What do they want digital to play a role in and what they're doing? And this work is still really early. Like we've identified some priorities for the communities where we're working. We have this list of 10, and out of most of them, they're really interested in parent well-being. So like well-being, mental health, mental well-being, like tools to support that. They're really interested in becoming better parents, so parenting skills in early life. And what they're finding is that the only really resource that they can rely on for any of that is friends and family, which is a resource that we're all becoming more aware of as being sometimes suspect in terms of like reliability, right? But really hard to dispute. Like you cannot argue with your mom about how best to raise your child, even though they've stopped making formula be preferred over breast milk like 30 years ago, right? And so like how do we get around that? One of the barriers is language. These top-down efforts, they'll always home in on the most popular languages. And so you get something from the WHO, it's going to be English, French, Spanish, maybe Chinese, and maybe Hindi, but like try and get it in Telugu or in, you might be able to get it in Xhosa, but you're not going to get it in Sesotho or any of the less resource languages. And unfortunately, the AI things that do translations that are so great, like they're not so great in the low resource languages. And so one of the agendas that we have going forward is how do we produce locally relevant resources that are available in local languages. Yeah, and then that just general problem of local relevance is this like ongoing question. I think this general problem of content creation is also an ongoing question, because as soon as you try and make it locally relevant, like production costs for really nice like public health videos or content is really high. Like I've tried to kind of outsource production costs and say, oh, you're an organization that produces digital media, and they're charging $30,000 per minute. And that just doesn't scale. I mean, I understand why they're charging that much. I understand why it costs so much to put together a radio program and put it on air. but they're obviously not viable solutions in the long run if we really want community-centered, if we really want to draw communities together in how they do work. I could also get into fathers and faith-based institutions.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, I mean, in thinking about, yeah, how these interventions play out, and if it doesn't make sense to, like, I guess, what institutions does it make sense to rely on? Which ones are going to stick around? So yeah, it'd be great if you can get into this.
The other thing that came up through our co-design workshops was every single community. We did this work in 4 different communities, 2 urban, 2 rural. Every single community says that the government should be working more closely with faith-based institutions in their information dissemination, that the faith-based institutions could do the work of making things locally relevant. Trust of the government changed from different places, but there was a lot of trust in faith-based institutions, even if those faiths are sometimes in conflict. So almost a lot of people will trust in kind of traditional medicine, traditional healers, but they'll also either go to a church or go to a mosque, and that conversation. And so there's kind of a wish that people would just talk to one another and agree. And that I think we don't see enough research in HCI where we're looking at faith. I think more of it's appearing now that there's more research happening in Asia and in Africa and in Latin America, that like faith is so central that you can't keep it out. But we need to be doing more research on the role of faith in how people adopt technology, use it, like faith-based voices, and how are they leveraging technology for not just proselytizing about the faith, but really for building community and helping communities be resilient and helping people rely on one another.
And then I was wondering if you could also talk about, yeah, the role of spouses in the context you studied. I mean, I think that's kind of an increasing focus, like, as expanding who exactly needs to, could be doing the work of caring for mothers or newborns.
Yeah, so like technically, we tried to do workshops where there were both men and women, so both fathers and mothers present. We also actually asked caregivers, other caregivers, so not just the biological mother and father, but often the aunts and the uncles or the grandmothers that are involved in caregiving. And we found that it's really hard to recruit non-mothers because in this field, because it's so ingrained in research that when you're doing maternal and child health, you only talk to the mothers. And then when we talked to the fathers, they said, we really want to help, but we read all the materials that are out there and they're all speaking to the mothers. So there's no role for us. There's no way that we have, like, we're not supposed to have a voice in this. And I think this is really, you dig into it and then you start to write about it and the reviews come back and say, why are you trying to give men more power over these women? And so we're like, that's not the right conversation. Maybe we need to frame this better. But there's a lot of work involved in framing what's happening in the African context, in the sort of non-African ideologies that are governing how we write our reviews around these papers. And I think, well, okay, that's a whole other rabbit hole. We've tried to really engage more with male partners, male spouses for their role in caregiving. In our work in Cape Town, it's a non-issue. There's fathers that really want to be engaged and they are engaged. And they're happy to show up for our workshops, often though it's the fathers who are working and so they can't come, but sometimes it's the mothers who are working and they can't come, the fathers show up for the workshops. It's been harder in the township settings and in the rural settings because I think the number is quite high, but like 50% of, at least 50%, if not closer to 70% of households do not have the child's biological father living in the same household. And so this idea of father should be playing a role is almost a non-starter, because either the fathers are working in another city and that's where they found employment and they're sending money home and that's their role, or they are because they're unemployed, they are alcoholic and abusive. Gender-based violence is a really big thing here, and so they don't want the father in the picture, except maybe to send money on occasion, unreliably. And I think that's another thing, but it has been different in every context, right? So working within a church group in Cape Town and with these with the NGO in Cape Town versus very, very rural Limpopo village, where you have really strong community structures that very vocally want fatherhood involvement, to, you know, low income township settings, and another low income township setting where it's much more like kind of the rest of South Africa, in that you have households that are multi-generational women raising the children. And so I don't want to impose my own value systems of expectations of what the fathers do. And so a lot of this has been really trying to be carefully inquiring without judging, but also just trying to see what opportunities there are. I think the mistake that we also made was just having the mothers and the fathers in the same room, because at least for that first workshop, because the father didn't, if it was one father, he didn't really feel comfortable talking. And if it was, and then when there were more, there was like, well, we don't feel comfortable being in the room when we're talking about postpartum care, right? And the mothers are like, we don't think they should be listening to us talking about postpartum bleeding, right? Like, there's just certain topics that are non-grata. And so that's all in our TDC paper, I think, from last year, like bits and pieces of it. And you also have cultural norms around like Lonifa and how that plays into how workshop dynamics play out and how you involve different stakeholders. I think there's good strategies for it, but every situation is a tad bit different. And so there's no one answer to how do you run a workshop that is inclusive of everybody and doesn't lead into like difficult, complicated dynamics. It always will be, and you just need to be empathetic and be able to respond well.
Yeah, I think this really resonates with me and like the work that I've done in maternal and child health, like kind of separating these questions of autonomy and well-being and gender, and like how those can be very separate. And sometimes you do have to separate them when focusing on, you know, certain, when basically trying to decide like what exactly is the goal here, and is it aligning with what the community wants. Yeah, and if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I guess while people might be thinking, one other question I had about this work is how it has changed over, you know, with the pandemic. Like you were talking about, you know, parents' mental health and well-being, and I know you've done work on like community amongst mothers. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think the pandemic ended in South Africa like over a year ago, so we've already forgotten everything. Yeah, I think one of the things that became apparent is that technology isn't as much of a barrier as you would think in these communities when the pandemic kind of threw everything down, but that also is really, you can't do workshops with these communities online, right? And so in one community, we just proceeded and did everything in person. But the three other communities, the organization basically just said no, like, we are not allowing any in-person research until this pandemic settles. And so for long time in this research, we had to do everything over the phone. We just did telephonic conversations, and it was really awkward and weird because it's just impossible to build rapport in a audio only call, like that's being translated and all sorts of other things. Um, and then when the pandemic kind of dialed down between waves, we actually did more in-person workshops, and people were so great. Like they were so happy to come together and see each other. One of the things that came out of some of our workshops is the groups that came together were like, oh, look, we've never actually talked to each other before. I've always felt like I was alone in all my experiences. And now I know that there's at least 5 other families that have experienced a thing, and they formed a WhatsApp group for themselves to keep communicating and keep connecting after that. And so the workshops themselves are a community building activity. And so that for me also touches on how overused, underused, how unclear that what a community is, right? We think of communities as sometimes geographic location, but if it's an urban geographic location, there often are not really close personal ties between people in the same geographic location. But in a rural setting, there are more, but it really depends on how that community is structured. And so, like, even in the Ocean View community, as we talk about it, the township, the community, is actually like, 100 overlapping communities. There's a Muslim community, there's a Rasta community, there's a Christian community, there's a high schooler community, like there's people that work for the government there. And they're not always connected or speaking to one another, even though they're in the same geographic location, which is really natural. But how do you think about that when we're approaching and trying to look at design, not just for individuals, but for communities, and for drawing people together, and not just you get my message, you change your behavior, but really getting the community talking about what is the desired behavior change and how do we want to go about making it happen.
Thank you. And we have questions in the chat. So Richmond, if you want to ask yours.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for sharing, your experiences about these different arrangements of kind of maintenance of community relations and the thinking about exit and the kind of feminist ethnography. I'm curious in your projects how much of that you're able to kind of scaffold and plan ahead of time for engagements versus how much of it maybe becomes more emergent or iterative over time.
I think it depends on the project. I couldn't have planned for somebody to start another organization after the first one fizzled out, right? Like that was just organic. It happened within that community. But what I did plan to do was just sort of be consistently available and working in that community. And that was really a lot of David Johnson living near that community and going in anytime they was asked to go maintain the network, right? And so there you can make explicit plans ahead of time. So I wrote into, like, one of my PhD students, I wrote into her research proposal that she has to have a phase that is handover and maintenance, and that the last 4 months of her deployment, she could not touch the system. It had to be maintained by the organization. And then pandemic hit, everything went out the window. So that phase never happened because she actually did an initial workshop to talk about handover, and they're like, no, we can't do this, you have to stay. And so that's when I realized that handover cannot be at the end, right? Like we have to continually talk about it at the beginning. But if you look at ICT for D and HCI for D, like we don't think about sustainability and maintenance because it's just going to complicate the conversation. We just want to solve this problem of what is the usable interface, not what is the most sustainable and maintainable interface in the long run. We just assume that somebody else will solve that problem. And often capitalism dynamics might help solve that problem, but often it doesn't, which is why, like, you know, most pilots never really come into fruition. And so now my strategy is relationships, right? Like I'm very clear about what I can and cannot promise, and I can promise a year in advance with the limitations that my students are my students. And so I do very qualified promises, and I think that's really easy to do when the power dynamics are in my favor, because they'll take whatever. But to, when I ask, also be okay with them not wanting to participate because nothing's come into fruition before. The other thing I do is when I work with NGOs, I ask my students to volunteer 1 day a week at that NGO. And they don't all do this, and it doesn't work with every NGO. But I say, look, even if whatever you develop ends up not being usable at the end of the project, at least they got your time 1 day a week for that year, and that they were able to get like benefit from the relationship, even if the software itself is not going to pan out. But with the sort of unpredictability of like whether I'm going to have funding to continue a project, whether I'm going to have a student to continue on that project, it's hard. It's just, I have one project where now we're on 4.0. Basically, we do the project for a year, and then I don't have students to work on that project for a year or two, and then I get a group of students to work on it. And then at the end, they're like, oh, we didn't have time to deploy. And so I get another group of students to work on it. And they're like, oh, this thing that they said they were ready to deploy, but they didn't have time to, it's going to take us 6 months of work to get it working again, because Flutter has changed their API again. And then I don't have students for another year. And now I have another student. And I wrote to them this week, and I was like, look, I've got another student. I think she'll be really great. I apologize, I haven't spoken to you for a year, but sorry. And she wrote back to like, I was just thinking of you. I'm so excited to hear from you. And so these, like making it upfront that the relationship is going to be like a little bit off and on, and that resources are a little bit off and on, but like the intentions there, we want to continue to have a relationship. We want to still be in conversation no matter what. It makes it so that you're able to apply for grants. It makes it so that you're able to approach them when you do have resources, and go from there.
Thanks, Melissa. So before we end the recording, just wanted to again thank our amazing guest for a great conversation so far. And next week, Andrew will be hosting Abdul El Ali at CWI.